I'm really very pleased to be here today to join with you in the celebration of your 250th anniversary. I spoke here once before, 25 years ago, when you were celebrating your 225th anniversary. By the time you get to the 275th anniversary, I'll be a really old crock and will be too old to do this again, if I haven't already gone to glory. I am a professional historian and not a preacher, so if you get a history lesson this morning, that's because that's what I do. But I had a pastor who said that professors and preachers are in the same business. The professor tells the truth, and the pastor yells the truth. I know from doing research in your church history that time after time, someone from First Baptist Church in Providence came here to give an address on a special occasion, or to deliver an ordination message, or an installation sermon for a new pastor, or to preach a revival, to fill the pulpit when you were without a pastor. So I come to you from the First Baptist Church in America to bring greetings from that old church to this old church. Happy birthday to you. Let me begin with a few facts about the Baptist Church in Warren. Your birth date is November 15th, 1764, 250 years ago. This was the 28th Baptist Church gathered in Rhode Island up to 1764. And Warren is one of only 11 of those churches that still exists. The rest of them have passed away. Most of them are long gone. If one counts all of the Baptist churches founded in Rhode Island between 1638 and 1940, there were nearly 250 of them. Only 80 of them still exist today. So only about 1/3 survived over time. So lasting 250 years and still being here is something to celebrate. It's pretty miraculous when you think about it. I know that Dr. Charles Hartman, who is the past minister of the First Baptist Church of Swansea, has told you about the relationship of his church to this church, as they regard themselves as your mother church. But your church and my church, the First Baptist Church in America, has had a lengthy relationship as well. In addition to all of the speakers just mentioned over the years, we have shared 39 people who went from Warren to Providence and 31 who went from Providence to Warren. I think maybe the last one of those might have been Mildred Sitnick, and maybe some of you knew her, who came here in the latter years of her life. Among those individuals that we have shared over time were three men who pastored your church. One was James Manning, your first pastor. The second was John Pittman, your third pastor. And the third was Flavel Shurtleff, your seventh pastor. I found it really coincidental that you would be talking about Flavel Shurtleff this morning. Our relationship began on a somewhat unhappy note when your first pastor, James Manning, left without your permission when the college, then called Rhode Island College, was moved to Providence in 1770. He was the president of that college, and that's why he was in Rhode Island. He was to be the president. So when the trustees voted to move the college to Providence, he went with it. But he was not properly dismissed. And when the Warren Church complained bitterly that he left the church bereft of a shepherd. You can hear it in the minutes of a meeting of May 4th, 1770. It said that he left, quote, without calling the church together to acquaint or discuss with them, which doing is contrary to his promise with the church, and whereby he hath broken covenant with the church, and left them destitute of a pastor or elder. Another church meeting was called on May 31st and demanded that Manning show up and explain why he left the church. And it said he did appear at a meeting on June 28th, but the clerk recorded, "He gave the church no satisfactory reasons why he left the church destitute of a pastor or elder." So they never really forgave him for having left them. But James Manning and the Baptist College were part of a larger effort among Baptists in Boston, New York, Newport, Philadelphia, to elevate the Baptist image in America. You have to understand that down to 1750, 1760, Baptists were generally regarded by the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, the Dutch Reformed as a bunch of ignorant fanatics. Only the Quakers had a worse reputation for ignorance and fanaticism than did the Baptists. Baptists were seen as ignorant because only a handful of their ministers, out of hundreds, only a handful, maybe enough you could put in a closet, had a college education, and all these other denominations required their ministers to have college educations, to Anglicans, to Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Dutch Reform. And all the others had established colleges and schools of training, Harvard, Yale, and Dartmouth by the Congregationalists, King's College, which is now Columbia, University of Pennsylvania, and William and Mary by the Anglicans. Princeton was the Presbyterian College, and Rutgers was the Dutch Reformed College. There was no Baptist college at all. The vast majority of Baptist pastors were uneducated men who earned their living as farmers, artisans, tradesmen, and the like. One of them, for example, boasted, "St. Paul was a tent maker. I'm a cooper." They were unpaid preachers except for what might be given as an offering. But even that was refused by some of them, as they regarded taking money for such work committed the sin of simony. If we went back to that, how much money could churches save, you know? Some felt that pastors, if they received a salary, would be committing the sin. But the movement to professionalize and to gain respect for Baptist clergy included a proper education, a salary and living, observing the Lord's Supper on a regular basis, more formality and greater dignity in the worship services, including written sermons, because there are very few Baptist sermons to be found prior to this movement, because the sermons were supposed to come right from the heart, not out of anybody's book, and of course were not written down. Another thing, by the way, that came along with this movement was the taking of the voice and vote from women in the church and in the church meetings. None of the other churches did that. You know, the Anglicans, the Congregationalists, Presbyterians, the Dutch Reform allowed women to speak in their meetings and take votes. So in order to become respectable in the eyes of these folks, the Baptists had to do the same thing. And that's what the movement out of the Philadelphia Baptist Association did. And this is what James Manning brought to Rhode Island and to Warren and to First Baptist in Providence, too. Manning was a graduate of Princeton, and he was the person sent to Rhode Island by the Philadelphia Baptist Association to obtain a college charter. The Philadelphia Baptist Association selected Rhode Island simply because it had no college and because there were a lot of Baptists here, although by then they came in 5 flavors already. You know the old joke about Baptists, where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there's a schism? Manning was elected president of this new college. Of course, the college had no students yet, and yet Manning needed a livelihood. However, no suitable pulpit was available either in Newport or Providence. But just at that moment, the people who formed this church needed a pastor, a good Calvinist pastor. In 1764, besides the Warren Church, there were only 4 other churches in Rhode Island that were clearly Calvinist. But all of them, except one, was out in the boondocks, places like Exeter, Cumberland, and Gloucester. So the college began here, as you probably know from plaques on the wall, and the first class graduated here in 1769. In addition to that, the first regular Baptist association in New England was started here in 1767, and its home base was this church. It was called the Warren Baptist Association. But the Warren Church was the only Baptist church in Rhode Island that was part of that association. All the other 17, 18, or 20 churches were in Massachusetts. And the principal work of the Warren Association for the first several decades was to fight for religious freedom in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Now, it's interesting to note that after Manning became the pastor of the Providence Church in 1771, that church didn't join the Warren Association until about 13 years later, 1784. Now, the reason for that delay is quite simple. Money. He needed money to support the infant college. And since most of the Baptists in Rhode Island were General Sixth Principle Baptists, he had to keep a foot in that camp as well as in the camp of the regular Baptists. Money is what carried the college away from Warren to Providence in the first place, and money was a dire situation for the college for many, many years. For a long time, the Baptist church in Providence was more wealthy and powerful than the Baptist college in Providence. So Manning had to get money from all the kinds of Baptists there were, and that meant having to maintain connections with the General Sixth Principle Baptists, of which the Providence Church was. So Manning left and was replaced by Charles Thompson, whose plaque is right here on this wall, the valedictorian of the first graduating class in 1769. And then came the American Revolution and the British attack upon Warren on May 25th, 1778, which led to the destruction of your first meeting house. They burned it down. They burned the parsonage down. They took Thompson prisoner, took him down in Newport and held him as a prisoner there for nearly a month. Part of the reason for that was he had become a chaplain in the American Army. So they regarded him as an enemy alien or an agent. The church members were scattered, and the church ceased to exist until it reconstructed itself in 1786. Many of the scattered members went back over to Swansea to the mother church. Some came to Providence, some went to other places. In 1779, Charles Thompson became the pastor of the Swansea church, but he wouldn't return to Warren when they sought to revive the church here. Instead, Warren called John Pittman, a member of the First Baptist Church in Providence, and he served as your reconstructed minister, if you like, from October 1786 until January 1790. Now, I can't refrain from making the point that when you built your second meeting house, James Manning, the runaway pastor, helped raise money to build that second meeting house, built in 1784. Now think about it for a second. Between 1770 and 1778, the Warren Church lost its first two ministers and saw its meeting house and parsonage burned to the ground. The town's population plunged by 1/3. The congregation was scattered and was only been able to reconstruct itself, revive itself by 1786. Now that's a hard decade and a half. And it's testimony to the faithfulness of those founders and the followers that church survived it all. You know, I suppose you could have another 250th anniversary in 2036, marking the reestablishment of your church in 1786. The history of any institution is a combination of what historians call the great man theory and the kind of social forces theory. And one of these, the great man theory, emphasizes the great figures, the leaders, the movers and shakers. For example, you might talk about the age of Napoleon. The other side emphasizes the great fundamental social, political, and economic forces that carry people along like boats on a river. Another term used by historians to designate the same period as Napoleon is to call it the age of democratic revolutions. And so Napoleon turns out to be only a piece of this larger area. Well, I happen to be a person who thinks that history reflects both of these things, both the great man and the social forces. So you can have a James Manning or Charles Thompson or whatever, and yet they are floating on a great sea of things. They play roles in situations they don't really control. This is the same as true of churches. They are the product of leaders and followers and also larger social forces. Mostly I've talked about some significant names, but I hope you notice that these were carried along by larger forces. James Manning was here only because the Baptist movement wanted a college. Had the Philadelphia Baptist Association picked a different place, a different colony, he'd never been here. And Manning left you because he was the president of that college that was moved by its board of trustees to a town that could provide greater money support. Charles Thompson and the Baptist Church in Warren were victims of the American Revolution. He left you because the meeting house and parsonage were burned down and he was taken away as a prisoner. And he was left, and the church scattered. He's left without a congregation. After his imprisonment by the British, he became a refugee, going to Ashford, Connecticut to fill the pulpit there for a while before he then returned to the church in Swansea in 1779. A church familiar to him and one that was still open, where he stayed in part because it was a much more secure position, and he had a successful ministry that lasted until 1800. So the history of Warren Baptist reflected larger movements in Rhode Island and in the nation. For one thing, there would not have been a Baptist church here at all if the town had not grown in the mid-18th century, and if it weren't for the First Great Awakening, that great revival movement of the 18th century, which caused Baptists to grow from little more than a sect, small sect, into a substantial denomination. As we sometimes forget as Baptists, since there are millions of us now, that in 1700 there were only a couple hundred Baptists altogether in all the 10 or 12 or 15 churches. We're tiny, could be ignored by nearly everybody. But as a result of the Great Awakening, they grew from a few hundred to nearly 100,000. It was a revival in 1763 and 1764 that produced a large enough body of Baptists here in Warren to want them to have their own church. Most of these people had been members of the Swansea church, but now they wanted a church nearer home. You know, in those days you had to go, think about it, going to church even miles, just a few miles in winter over roads that were just a little more than cow paths. You'd want a church close by where you could walk to it, and that's what people wanted here in their own town. They wanted one closer to themselves. So in the fall of 1763, Manning came to Warren to preach, and he increased the congregation by baptizing a number of people. And we've already mentioned why he's here. He was here in Rhode Island to create a college. The need for a college was also the result. The college was also a result of the Great Awakening. There would be no Baptist college without that Great Awakening. So, both Manning's coming to Rhode Island and finding a body of new believers were the consequences of larger forces. The growth of the town itself created a large enough congregation to desire their own church, leading to the establishment of this church in 1764, the same year that Warren is set off as a separate town. It became a prosperous maritime town involved in shipbuilding and all the trades associated with that, rope walks, sail making, and what have you. But then came the American Revolution, which brought devastation and disruption, interrupting the town's progress for a time. However, after the Revolution, the town recovered and became second only to Providence in the business of building ships. It prospered in the maritime shipping trade and whaling in the late 18th and early 19th century. As the town grew, so did the Baptist Church. The membership, which had been 58 in 1764, had actually climbed back to 52 by 1800. That's the effect of the Revolution and the scattering of the church. A lot of people who were members here in 1770 76, 75, didn't come back, or 78, didn't come back. They went off to other places. So you got back to 52 by 1800, as the church recovered from its near extinction. Then in the 19th century, the Second Great Awakening exploded across the land. Your church experienced revivals in 1805, 1812, 1813, 1820, 1834, 1858. This church saw its membership grow nearly 700% between 1805 and 1858. In that period, your church started a Sunday school and a library, joined the home and foreign mission movements, joined the Rhode Island Baptist Education Society, the Rhode Island State Baptist Convention, and erected its present meeting house. I cannot refrain from making the point that your 1820 revival here was triggered by the preaching of Dr. Stephen Gano, the pastor of the First Baptist in Providence, who was a supply minister here after you fired your previous minister, the young Daniel Chessman. Now, joining a church back in those days was no easy matter. You didn't sort of walk in the door and everybody put the handcuffs on you and kept you there until you joined. No, when you came in those days, you underwent a personal examination and had to present a full testimony of your conversion experience, first before the deacons or standing committee, and then before the whole church. And it's a blackball situation. If one person objected, you were not admitted. And then, of course, in those days, people were submitted to the discipline of the church. And church meetings back in the 18th and 19th century mainly dealt with discipline. Now, you may hate church meetings today and think they tend to be mostly about buildings, boilers, and bathrooms. But back then, church meetings were about drinking and fornication and adultery, divorce, lying, brawling, failure to pay one's debts or to take care of one's wife and children, attending a different church, failure to keep your church pledge. So if you think that church meetings today are awful, you might think of what they were back in those days. They were pretty much group trials and group criticism. They'd argue about everything we'd fight about today, then a whole lot more. When is the last time that Warren Baptist kicked somebody out for premarital sex, or getting divorced, or drinking, let alone getting drunk? Well, those things were standard causes for discipline and dismissal back in the period of 1764 to 1864. However, by the mid-19th century, the whaling industry had collapsed, and church and shipbuilding declined, and Warren turned to other enterprises, including textile mills. The coming of the mills changed the character and demography of Warren. The people who came to work in the mills were largely immigrants from Roman Catholic places. First, the Irish, French Canadians, followed by Poles, Italians, Syrians, Austrians, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. By 1905, Rhode Island had a majority Roman Catholic population, the first state in the Union for that to be true. And this church, like many others, such as First Baptist in Providence, sought to cope with the situation by trying to Christianize the Catholics, to convert them from Catholicism to Protestantism, with almost no success. Warren Baptist tried holding foreign language services for Protestants from Germany and Sweden. And the minister who held these services between about 1893 and 1914 declared that the efforts among the Germans had met with good success. But then he lamented that Warren was being filled with, quote, the foreign element which has been more or less hostile to Protestantism. He said these new people were, quote, a totally different type of men who came to America not for freedom but for gain. Well, these kind of anti-immigrant attitudes were common among Americans in the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century and led to literally racist legislation, restrictive laws in the 1920s, which weren't repealed, by the way, until the 1960s. Well, the demographic shifts were one of those larger movements against which no individual could stand. The change in Rhode Island to a majority immigrant Roman Catholic population changed the picture for all Protestant churches in the state, and many of them disappeared as a result. This church, like other Protestant churches, now had to fish in a smaller stream, but with the automobile you might cast a wider net. There would be no more great revivals, no more great spurts of growth, but you would persist and endure. You would still be here after so many others had fallen by the wayside. The fire is still burning here, I think. But as has been said, be sure you take the fire from the altar of the past, not the ashes. What role do you play in this new religious climate of nothinarians, those seeking spiritual food but saying they're not religious? How can you welcome them? How can you serve them? The old model that was true in the 17th and 18th and 19th century was you make them believe, then you teach them how to behave, and then you let them belong. Today, many think that that's upside down, that what we have to do now is let people belong. Then they'll learn to behave, and then they'll come to believe. One of the scriptures today was about Thomas. You notice he wasn't kicked out when he doubted. He was allowed to belong until he came to believe. We'll give folks a welcoming place where they can come to hear the stories of Jesus, and they will come to believe. Thank you for listening to me.